P&R with Adam R. The 3 P&R. I'm your host, Adam R. And joining me for this episode is true crime author Leslie Ghiglieri. Leslie, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Adam.
Great to have you back. Today's topic, Ed Kemper. You had a close call with him. This guy's beyond interesting. Like I was telling you in pre-podcast, I looked into his childhood. I typically want to look at everyone, from the root. And he had a strange upbringing, really strange upbringing. So to give you some context before we dive deeper into it, he was emotionally, verbally, and somewhat physically abused as a kid by both his mother and his grandmother. And his father, it's a strange thing. Apparently his father would behead chickens, make dinner. He was sensitive to this. The father made him eat dinner, knowing the chicken was just killed by him, and he cried. So there's definitely not your stereotypical psychopath involved here. This guy, he runs deep. So what's your opinion on Ed Kemper?
Well, it's interesting, I think, about his childhood, because the first source that I went to was pretty much what you're saying. It was talking about how awful his parents were, how bad his mom was, how she would lock him in the basement. He was in there with rats, and just a single light bulb that would hang down from the ceiling, not regular lighting down in the basement. It sounded horrible. It sounded like anybody would turn into sort of an odd adult after living through that childhood. But after I had spoken with one of the investigators that was closely involved with the case, he was telling me that he believes that a lot of those stories were inflated. Now, I have a book now that has quite a few quotes from his sister. One of them, the other one, I don't think she gave much of an interview to anyone, but I'll be interested to see her view from a child growing up in the same household. But for instance, the detective told me that he talked to someone who went to the actual house, and it wasn't even constructed the way Ed had described it. There was no lock on it. There were just things about it that made it suspicious. And I often wonder, with these murderers that are investigated and then later interviewed for their insight about their crimes, how they just maybe taint the details to sort of fit what they want to present about what they had to go through. It's hard to say for sure,
Yeah, well, bear this in mind. You're speaking to a child mind, right? When I was a kid, my father took me down to Red Hook, the docks, and it was, at the time he was working, he was, craftsmanship, contracting. And so I'm down by these docks, and it's rainy out. It's nasty outside. The waves are big, and, it was a fright for a kid, I guess. It's a frightening experience. You see these big waves crashing over the wall, and you start entertaining your worst fears, like tsunamis. Now, throughout my life, I had reoccurring dreams of tsunamis. To this day, I still have it. On occasion, it's the same setting, same location, the same boats I saw then. Frightening for me as a kid. And do you tend to inflate it a little bit? Sure. Because when you entertain your worst fears, your brain runs to places creatively that you normally logic would not take part in, right? It wasn't until 2010 when I revisited New York. I had to drive my mom up there, and I went by this dock, and it's not even nearly as scary as depicted as the child memory I had of it. It wasn't even this. In fact, it wasn't even as large as my memory served. And my dream most certainly inflated it. So for Ed Kemper to sleep in a basement, and the reason his mother put him down there is because she feared he would do something to his sisters for, her reasons and motivations still unclear. But In a child's mind, it's the dungeon, and there's these cast iron locks on it, and that one single light. It's cold and dreary because you're a child, and when you're a child, you're absorbing information, and the imagination of children. Think about that creative upbringing when you're playing with your toys, and like even me, I would have full scale wars in my room with my toys. You know what I mean? Like epic movie setting wars, and so in my imagination, there's this massive battle. So again, when you are looking back now, had you asked me about the docs and those dreams prior to 2010, my memory would still serve me as it's this huge, concrete, frightening place where there's crashing waves, because that's all I could recall. It wasn't until I actually looked at the place like, wow, did I blow this out of proportion? But even the profound effect of it is even to this day, even as recent as like a few weeks ago, I had COVID over the summer. So, I usually take summers off from the podcast. Then I have COVID, and I had a recurring dream during my COVID experience of that. So when I hear Ed Kemper recall that basement and that scenario, his frame of mind, his age play in effect, and yeah, it's a little inflated. If you were to take him back there now as an adult, would he share the same fears? It depends on your psychology. He's a really smart guy. His IQ's up there. So, but yeah, continue on what you found of it.
No, you're right when you mention that about children, especially. They're really sensitive. I think as adults, we do lose sight of that. When you have young children in your home, you start to pay attention to how they respond to things, and you're pretty quick to see how sensitive they are to things that happen around them. So that could be, maybe the truth somewhere in the middle, but maybe as he remembers it and as he told it was reality. And if that's the way he remembers it, it kind of is his own reality, even if the details are not maybe true exactly. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, because typically logic doesn't start prevailing till mid-teens when you get that border where imagination's meeting reality. When you're a kid, or at least for most children, you grow up in a home, and your imagination, your friends, and fun, you enjoy time at its fullest, versus when you're older and logic prevails, and in time's not. It's not the ally and friend you think it is. It'll pass you by, because then you're preoccupied. You got to mix work, and then you got to mix pleasure, and then you have a family, et cetera, et cetera. Another example, when I was a kid, my aunt had me. So our superintendent of my grandmother's building in Brooklyn, he had like large hair, like an afro, right? And so my aunt told me that his head was going to explode. And I was terrified of this guy. I was terrified of him. But that made me realize that's the child mind. So whenever I saw this guy, I believe his name was Noel, I thought I couldn't get near him. His head was going to explode. So, and to this day, even right now as I'm recalling this, I could depict his face, what he was wearing when I saw him last. These are the profound effects on people. So for Ed Kemper, when you're entertaining your worst nightmare, being in a dark basement and there's rats and it's cold, yeah, it could definitely. He can inflate that a bit, right? The imagination takes over, and your brain, like, when you're in a dark room and you hear that noise, most people entertain the worst thoughts because it's in our primitive nature is to defend ourselves from the creature of the night, and so our imaginations run to the most dangerous places you could imagine. So when he's recalling that place or he's telling the story of it, what person is telling that story? Is it Ed Kemper now, or is it child Ed Kemper who recalls it that way?
Well, and there's no question that the circumstances in the home, his mother was a very dominating personality and loud, and so was his father. And they were both large people, just physically large. So it had to be a pretty intimidating household, even if the details about the basement are not exactly true. But yeah, when I read all of those things, I thought, well, there's no wonder, but But if they are true, then for sure they played into whatever other issues he had. The things that you do as an adult to compensate for your fears that took place when you were a child and you couldn't do anything about it.
Sure. And it could have been a trigger, right? I was reading some time ago, I read from some psychologist from the 80s who says the psychopath is in everyone. It's, do we act on them? Is there a trigger? Like what Ed Kemper, his IQ's high. He's a really intelligent guy. He was so much so that he would ride around with co-eds that he didn't kill to get information about this where do I stand in this investigation? He would watch true crime shows to figure out, what it is that he needs to do to avoid capture. At the same time, he killed his grandparents, right? His first victims, calls his mother, and then turns himself in. After his string of murders, he turns himself in. Like for a typical serial killer, this is unheard of. Like, he didn't seek glory, didn't know letters to the press. He didn't really demonstrate like that kind of alpha personality that desired the attention. And, so he's not a narcissist. He's just a strange individual. I think something snapped in him. And, it could be attributed to stolen youth. Like we saw these behaviors, not murderous behaviors, but behaviors in Michael Jackson when his youth was taken. What'd he do? He built a fantasy ranch. He built this amusement park at his house. Like even me, in my youth, wanted certain kinds of pairs of shoes growing up. My parents didn't see it as being feasible. And here I am, an adult, and I got crazy amounts of Nikes and Jordans, and subconsciously you come to the realization that, well, I'm trying to reestablish something I didn't have in youth. So it's bizarre. So here's the scary part with Ed Kemper. The amount of murders in the small amount of time that he did it. I can't say he had remorse. I can't even say he had guilt. I heard someone say, he turned himself in over being guilty. I don't know. Because when you watch his interviews, he's recounting those murders in great detail. And I don't see an emotion. I don't see satisfaction. I don't see remorse. It's blank. And I think that frightens me the most. He was very matter of fact when he speaks about it. So we'll dive into this. You had a pretty close call with him. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, I didn't know it was Ed Kemper at the time. It kind of evolved into, I'll start at the beginning, I guess, we lived close to him, about a minute walk from where he lived and where his mother lived. And he didn't live there all the time. After he got out of Atascadero for being there for murdering his grandparents, he split his time. He had an apartment up in Almadena. Where is that? Up near San Francisco? Alameda, I think.
Yeah.
And then he also would come down and stay at his mother's. So he kind of went back and forth. And his mother lived close to where we did. And so my initial circumstance was that we started receiving at my home, I was a teenager at the time, phone calls, obscene phone calls, and didn't know who they were from. I don't know how in detail you want me to explain all of that, but it was through that initially that I was working at Cabrillo College. Even though I was in high school, I was taking some classes at the junior college where actually Kemper was a student there. I didn't know him. As far as I know, I never saw him. And at least walking around, I think I would have made note of the fact a guy that's 6'9" and weighs almost 300 pounds. It's somebody that you'd kind of remember if you saw them walking around. But I worked at the bookstore, and after the phone calls initially started, I was really paranoid because the person that had called on the phone, I had answered the phone and the person asked for me by name. So whoever it was knew me, and then they knew where I lived because the phone number is listed in the phone book, which has our address. So it was very scary to me that someone who I obviously didn't know was calling me and saying the things that he was saying. So I got very paranoid. So it was a very frightening time for me when I was getting these calls. And of course, we called the sheriff's office, and they came out and did what they could to try to trace the phone calls, which at that time it was pretty impossible because we're talking the early 70s. And so we just didn't have all the techniques we do. Of course, we didn't have caller ID or anything that would say where the calls were coming from. And I was told that unless we knew who it was, of course, they can't stop the phone calls or make any charges. And even if he was threatening my life, it was, and the first time when he called, I told the detective that came out, the caller was very matter of fact. He was quiet, just this is what he's going to do. And it wasn't like kids, as kids, I don't know if you did, Adam, but I have to admit that we did a little playing around on the phone sometimes when we were home and our parents weren't, made prank phone calls to people. It was nothing like that. It was totally different. And it was chilling to me from the very beginning. And it was funny because I have been doing more research about Ed Kemper, and I was listening to an interview with Michael Aluffi, one of the sergeants involved with this case. And he said, there are two things I can tell you about Edmund Kemper. One of them is he's very matter of fact. And I just thought, I didn't even hear the second one because I thought that's exactly the words I used. And you used it earlier, too, when you were talking about interview. And that's exactly the way he was on the phone.
I was making observations of his interviews. And to me, when he was interviewed, it reminded me of a CEO of a company where they stuck to the fact, right? They had their bullet points. They knew exactly what they're going to speak about. In other words, they stayed within a narrative. And when he speaks about his past and his murders and his experiences, that's the impression I got. Almost like he had a bullet point, like he had a presentation prepared. So no emotion, no you didn't see the left or right eye shifting for recalling. It's as if he studied it and knew it perfectly. And I found it disturbing. So when I'm hearing you and you're getting calls and the person speaking at almost a monotone, they're speaking about heinous acts, and they're not like you said, when kids prank call, they're like, yeah, this, and there's emotion. There's there's excitement. Look, when you asked me if I played on the phone, forget it. I was terrible. When I was a kid, the Jerky Boys were around. So of course, to us, it's, but you could tell when someone's pranking. This guy, this isn't a prank. This is him speaking at length what his intentions are.
Yes, exactly. And I noticed as I'm listening to him talk about the things he has done and the things he's going to do or what he was thinking at the time, he said several times, at one point he decided the week before he killed his mother, he said, I'm going to kill my mother. And it was just like that. Like, that's what I am going to do. He's not, I'm thinking about it, or if things don't change, he's just like, that's his plan. That's what he's going to do. So he's very matter of fact. So when he called us, he started calling at all hours, would call, sometimes hang up, would call, at 2 a.m. and 2:15 and 2:30, and then he wouldn't call for a few days. And finally, my mom, whenever anybody else answered, he just would hang up. So she picked up the phone. It was very late at night, and she picked up the phone, and we were all frazzled. Everybody was on edge, and she asked him. She said, "What do you want? What do you want with my daughter?" And he said, "I'm going to rape your daughter." He said, "I'm going to kill her, and then I'm going to rape her."
I could see in your face. I mean, our listeners can't, but you're having a chemical response to this, an emotional response. And I could so let me ask you, was this experience part of what pushed you towards law enforcement and true crime? Was understanding the circumstances surrounding the calls and that close? I mean, you got to understand, Leslie, this isn't a man full of hot air. He acted on these impulses. And I somewhat feel, just by hearing what you're saying, that you were one of many calls in that time frame. Like, I think he was gauging response. He was looking for vulnerabilities. Like, in other words, he was poking the fence to look for weaknesses. When the availability of your family was there, when you were alone. This is all that's coming to my mind. And you have to wonder if you're one of many calls in this checklist to look for these vulnerabilities to figure out who is going to be targeted next. This is a time period where there's no caller ID. To trace a call then had to be an active call and had to go through circuit boards. And even then it was hit or miss where they're going to get if they're going to be exact. That's a frightening experience to you, but I could see you're having an emotional response to it. And so that's the profound effect from your youth that it's like my reoccurring wave dream. It's always going to be a frightening experience for you in your personal psychology, in the frame of your mind. It's damaging. So it's troublesome. So as you're recalling this, and your family's involved, and in that era, you could only call the police so many times and say, this is what's being said, because they're really, in that era, again, powerless to discover who's behind this.
So what they ended up doing, we did try to do what you're talking about, and I'm going to do a little bit of research about exactly what the phone company did during those times. I just remember that we would have to leave the phone off the hook, and then we'd have to somehow make a call in and report it. And then they would try to trace it, but they could only trace, like you said, certain numbers. So at that time, we still kind of have prefixes, even though we use area codes all the time. But like, say it was a 688 prefix. If he was calling from a 425 prefix, you wouldn't be able to trace it. Only if he was, they could only do each prefix at a time.
Right.
And so once they did that, the call was disconnected. If he called from a payphone, you'd never find him. So I remember Detective Medina that came out. He told me, well, what we could do is we could trap him. We could have you set up believe this or not, like looking back, it just seems rather humorous to think about. But he said we could set up a meet with him. You could agree to meet him. Like, who would do that after a phone call like that? But anyway, he was just trying to figure out a way. But he said, if we caught him, if you set up a meet and then we caught him, he would get, the maximum would be a $500 fine and 6 months in jail. So I'm thinking, well, if he wasn't going to do me in, then he wouldn't be too happy after that 6 months in jail. So I'm like, that's not a good plan, and my dad was he was an ex-military, and he was very upset, just about his daughter. And the thing that got me later at him was that he was saying he was going to murder me and then he was going to rape me. See, who does that, right?
Right.
And that was kind of Kemper's signature.
I think what he did there, and look, I'm not an expert. I've just been reading a lot about serial killers since we established our team. We're going to talk more about these. If they're not getting the response from their victims they want, it's almost like a turnoff. So if he's speaking to you very matter of fact, and you very matter of fact respond like, well, I mean, I guess if you're going to do that, we'll have to, notify the authority. If you didn't have like a major emotional response, it was like almost like a lion's not going to try to kill someone that's just laying there. They want to hunt, Mm-hmm. Like, what was that? Was that from Jurassic Park? Like T-Rex doesn't want to be fed. He wants to hunt, like that kind of, I think that's what he was looking for. Is like who got so there might have been some other girl in the time frame he's calling you where she had a serious response. It's like panic in her voice. And, it's like turning your back to the lion. It's going to attack. I mean,
I just never said anything to him. I just hung up the phone after that first time because he rattled off what he had to say. And I was so stunned by it that I said, what? Just because I was so just shocked someone was talking like that to me on the phone. And then he repeated it. And I just hung up the phone.
Meanwhile,
anyway.
By doing that, you might have averted an issue because there's the other girl who's like, who is this and why would you do this? And she had panic in her voice. And that is, you've just made the predator excited and salivated to come after you. You know what I mean? So maybe your response might have been the reason you weren't a target. You know what I mean? He might have been testing you, but it was the other girl's response that geared him towards them. Had he called a New York house in Brooklyn and said these very things, he probably would have hung up. Because, the old Italian Irish women, they're like, yeah, come on, but, dare you to come in this neighborhood. So,
well,
I mean,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, look at the David Berkowitz thing where women were changing the color of their hair. Full neighborhoods of men were loading up with bats and sticks. They were actively hunting this guy, where in your region, a little more lax. For them, it's like a playground. But I think your responses might have spared you.
Well, we found out later that the people next door to us were getting phone calls, but they were just hang-up calls. And the people next door to them were also getting phone calls, but just hang-up calls. So during that period, after he was calling me, he was also simultaneously calling the two houses next to us.
Yeah, he was vetting victims 100%.
Yeah.
So the people next door, were there girls living in these homes as well?
There was she wasn't teenager. She must have been, I think she might have even been a little older than me. But she was living at home. They had one girl, and then the people next door to them had little kids. So it was more just neighborhood harassment. So then you start thinking, oh, is this person live in the neighborhood? I mean, why would it be all three of our houses?
Yeah, he definitely didn't have a preference because looking at his victim list, there's anywhere from Italian to Irish to Asian. It was more the thrill. What year is this?
1970. Right in there. He was released from Atascadero in December of 69. And he said in one of his interviews, and I think he's kind of exaggerating again, because I don't think he ever gave up his fantasies, and being in Atascadero just fueled his fantasies. Anything he hadn't thought of in his own mind, he was reading in reports that he had access to of adult sex offenders. But he said that his fantasies started again 4 months after he got out of Atascadero. So that would have been in 70, right?
Yeah, so he's 22, 23 in his time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So his first co-ed murder, or the two girls, was 72, and then he was arrested in 73. So it was kind of short term, really. And you mentioned earlier about him turning himself in, and I was again listening to one of his interviews, and I remember him saying this, and I thought it was odd when he turned himself into his mother after he killed his grandparents, and she just said, you need to call the police. That seemed kind of not very reactionary to the situation, but I'm not sure what else she should have said, but that was very odd.
Consider his grandparents lived like in the top of a mountain on a vast piece of property of farmland. And so I think him calling his mother was more to punish her with that information, and whatever her response may be, this is hearsay. We don't know it could have been more excited. True. She could have been yelling. She could have been like, what's wrong with you? You piece of this and that and the other.
True.
And call the sheriffs. Like, bear in mind, this is a man who speaks very matter of fact about his crime. So when they're like, well, when you called your mother, what happened? He goes, well, she told me to call the sheriff. The emotional part to him doesn't matter. How she responded, what she said doesn't matter. You know what I mean? He stuck to the facts. She just said, call the sheriffs. And so for all we know, again, this is him punishing mom, because we both know where that led to. Yeah, he's a dangerous person because of his ability to think logically. He didn't go to crime scenes only because he was aware of his size. And even if they didn't suspect him, because he did make friends with cops, he did hang around cop bars. He had an interest in law enforcement. He knew the jargon, but he was also very aware that most killers go back to their victims' funerals or scene of the crime. And because of his size and stature, he logically came to the conclusion he shouldn't do that. It would definitely highlight him as a suspect if he was at all these places. He's not easy to miss, you know. In a crowd of people that have an average height of 5'8" and 5'10", this guy's a foot over the rest. He will be noticed. Even if it's subconsciously, he will be noticed, and he was aware of that.
Well, I do think you had a point a little bit back there that he turned himself in after all of this. I think he was calculating and thinking of doing other things, but I think maybe he did have an honest moment when he said, this has to stop. And I knew as long as I was out, it wasn't going to stop.
Yeah.
And that, I don't want to say I respect him for that, but I think that is really unusual.
Well, I think it's self-preservation. I think again, this is a really intelligent guy. His IQ, so people are aware, is right up there with Einstein. This isn't, this is really a way above average acuity. I think in his mind, one, he wanted public recognition without, like the Night Stalker were, this guy and the Zodiacs and these people that are interacting with the media. He needed it to be a little bit different. I think logically he said, eventually I'm going to be caught. They're going to have a dragnet. I'm going to turn myself in to prevent myself from seeing the electric chair. Because the capital punishment in that era was basically decided over lunch. Let's be honest. I think self-preservation was there. I think he turned himself in to say, look, this is what I'm doing. I need help. Because that's exactly how he phrased it. I have these problems. I did these things. He kept going towards therapy and psychology, utilizing that as a back door from his crime. And then, there immediately in the 70s, the FBI took an interest because serial killers that phrase wasn't even used or coined until the 70s. There's the show Mindhunter where, they played a little loose with some of the facts. Let's be honest, it's television. They got to be a little exciting, but it did come out to that where they were interviewing him to study the mind of these people. So his agreement to do that, again, wasn't to help law enforcement. It was for self-preservation. So I think part of his turn-in was he recognized he's already killed a lot of people. When you say serial killer and you hear the number 20, that's a big number for them. That's and today you can't, serial killers today with our technology, they have to be really, really educated to beat our system and beat forensics. And there are some out there to do it. You have to be ahead of that technology. That I think Ed Kemper came to the conclusion that, look, if I do this now, I'm one, because again, he's a smart guy. I think I don't want to use the word remorse. I cannot use the word remorse with him. Can't do it. You don't kill mom invite her friend over for dinner, and then strangle her in that same day, and then mutilate the bodies and do some of the unspeakable things he done to their bodies, and have remorse. That you can't. It's not possible. Yeah, that's not the realm of reality. However, I think logic prevails for him. He runs the odds. Like, what are the odds I'm going to be able to never be caught? What are the odds I'm going to be able to escape law enforcement? What are the odds that a jury's not going to have me electrocuted? Self-preservation. I think logic is what prevails for him. It has nothing to do with remorse whatsoever. I think with you, this is 1970, and his first kills that we know of publicly were 1972. I think something transpired in between 70 and 72 that we're unaware of, that he didn't speak of, because from what I'm learning about serial killers, their first victims, how do you phrase this? That doesn't sound sick. It's like their prize. It's like their virginity being lost. It's for them, not to be shared with anyone. It's an intimate moment. And I think he was vetting, and I think you were part of that vetting process. Which is I'm not a criminologist either, and yet I think he was ramping up. I think he had already done the worst you could do to somebody, taking the lives of his grandparents. So he'd already crossed that line. Right.
And then all he had done in being in a Atascadero for 5 years was just fed his mind with more dark and evil thoughts and fantasies. There was no rehabilitation that took place there. And I think he got out, and maybe he had some intention not of acting out his fantasies the moment he got out, but they had made a really big mistake by placing him with his mother. They told the officials at Atascadero, said, whatever you do, don't place him with his mother, because obviously that was a trigger point for him, and they knew it would not be good for her or for him. But what did they do? They placed him with his mother. So all the dynamics that were going on with him and her probably started to just accelerate the process. And then he probably wanted to start to act out these fantasies that he had in his childhood, and also through his time at Atascadero. And that's why he picked up, what did he say in one interview, 100 to 200 hitchhikers, just picking him up and giving him rides just to kind of experiment, just get the feeling of what it was like to pick up these girls, and just as kind of a dry run. So he did that on purpose for months.
I mean,
he actually...
When you hear that, here's a scary part of what you're saying. Like a lot of these serial killers, when you read about them, very impulsive. Their first kills are like a lot of detectives say, if you were going to catch them, it'd be within their first two. These are impulse. There's no ritual yet. Here's this guy. Like, all right, so his first murders are his grandparents, but that's a response, right? A response to his grandmother's abuse. He finally snaps, kills his grandfather because he doesn't want him to live with both dementia and the sad fact that his wife's been killed. That was a mercy murder in his eyes, right? And now you have him in this time period calling you, picking up hitchhiker. He's basically, I can't even just say he's working himself up to kill. He's developing not a ritual, but like the ability to, what's the best way to phrase this? He's studying. He's going to college for murder. He's learning, like, well, I'm going to pick him up. So he's got the nerves removed from him now about picking up hitchhikers. He's now familiar with it. He's calling and not pranking. These aren't pranks. He's frightening young ladies. He's gauging whether or not they're going to have fear in their voice, who's the right victim. He's teaching him. So he's honing a skill. That freaks me out more than an impulsive serial killer who's on bloodthirst, who's out there. This guy is literally studying how to be a murderer, how to get away with it, how not to sit in a crowd, how not to stand out. This should scare people that there's people out there like that. That shows intelligence. This is a scientist who's coming up with a formula. That should scare people. That
Well,
bugs
that's
me.
probably why the FBI decided to start doing studies and interviewing him in the hopes that they could glean some insight into the way he thinks and maybe apply it to just generally hunting down criminals like him.
Yeah. Yeah. That's, you know, when you're building profiles for the FBI, that data has to come from several sources, right? It's like any other data, right? If you look at science, how does science operate? Well, it starts in the imagination, becomes a theory, and then it's tested over and over again to see results. And if the results favor a positive result, it becomes not a science fact, but a part of science, because nothing's fact. You know, things are subject to change all the time.
Mm-hmm.
With Ed Kemper, yeah, they definitely should study that guy, and they should I don't want to say like we're going to up like Minority Report one day. You ever seen that movie with Tom Cruise?
No.
They were arresting people because they were forecasting them to be what they were going to become, which is really in itself a terrible idea because these are, again, I don't think you could forecast emotional response and impulse. I don't know how you would do that. But in that movie, they would use a machine and they would study all the people, the populace, and figure out who's dangerous and who's not. And they would arrest these people on murders and crimes that never happened or haven't happened yet, I should say. In a fiction world, that'd be great for serial killers. We'd stop them. But I don't think Ed Kemper would have been a murderer without the parents, without the father butchering, because the guy cried. Most serial killers started animals. You know what I mean? So, and I can't say all, but the majority anyway. Jeffrey Dahmer, a lot of these big name people started with animals. So this guy's crying at the sight of a chicken being beheaded and crying harder when his father's forcing him to eat the very chicken that they just killed for dinner.
Well, he did kill animals. I don't know if you didn't realize that.
Yeah,
but he did.
Late, but that was later on. I think that desensitized him to do the act. Mostly, again, curiosity based. You know, when you see things enough in life. Example, not every soldier is a murderer. They go to war, they sign up for the military, things happen. Some of them become damaged from the experience. Others become balanced by it. Dare I say, some of them become, you can only see so much murder before it takes a nasty toll on you. Like even the homicide detectives, like Jason White comes on with us a lot. He sees some horrible shit daily. He's a trained veteran of law enforcement, but eventually these things haunt you, regardless of how cast iron you are. And if they don't, I don't know, then maybe therapy, because that should be concerning in itself. This is demonstrated and exampled in medical facilities, doctors and nurses who see tragedy all the time, and you desensitize to it. But eventually, it catches up to you.
Well, you have marriages that break up, you have alcoholism. I mean, people have to figure out some way to deal with all that horror.
Yeah. So for you with the Ed Kemper phone calls, and when did all that come to an end?
Well, I would say for a while, I had moved from where my parents lived and had my own place. I graduated from high school and was taking junior college classes full time, and I had my own place. And it was the weekend that he killed his mother that it all pretty much came to a head for me. Oh, that was not very funny, was it? That was not on purpose. A little comic levity that you have to have, when
of course,
you deal with things like this. But it was that Easter weekend, because I had a very frightening experience at my parents' home when I went to meet them. And so for me, I did not realize that was connected at the time that it happened. I didn't realize that was connected to the phone calls because it had been a couple years. And then I didn't know that he was murdering his mother that weekend. Of course, I didn't know that. And when my parents, who were gone on a vacation, I didn't realize they were gone. I went to their house to see them and then remembered that they were gone, and I left. When my mother came home a couple days later, she called me up and asked me if I'd seen the paper. And I said, no, I hadn't. And she said, well, they found 2 women murdered across the street, and they're digging up body parts in the backyard. So that's what had happened that weekend. So that's when a lot of the pieces seemed to make sense. And then a few years after that, I was working for a veterinarian, and a lieutenant who worked for the sheriff's office came into the office because he had a horse, sheriff's posse. And we were talking, and I told him about my phone calls. And I told him about what had happened. And he said, that was Edmund Kemper. And he said he had plans to murder everyone in the neighborhood. And the way he had it figured out, he could have done it.
Man, it's creepy because one of the women he murdered, and I don't remember which one, but he buried the head with the face facing his mother's bedroom, right on the property.
Yeah.
And then I think after he killed his mother is when he really stopped his reign of terror, right? Because the object of his anger is it stopped. Mom's dead. What am I angry about?
Well, he did kill her friend after that to cover up the murder of the mother.
That's after kills mom, adrenaline's up. He's in that bloodlust, that psychological world he lives in when it happens. And, who knows how long it takes to come down from that. I would have no idea, but, he was still on that high, and he invited her over. And even if the high dissipated before she arrived, he's committed to what he's doing, There's people in the world, like, all right, let me give you an example. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, that guy should really frighten people because he was active I think it was 2005 when they got him, right? Or 06, I think it was 2005 when they arrested him because of DNA and et cetera. This guy lived among society as an active member of society, involved with park rangers. He tried to get in law enforcement, didn't pan out. I'm not clear why. I'll have to look deeper into him. But he had a family, and he was committing these heinous acts of murder on women, strangulation. He coined his own name, BTK, by using the media. He's an example of impulse. And so as far as I know, he didn't have a bad childhood and abusive parents. So his motives to become a serial killer they were psychologically in place before he hit adolescence. Right? So that guy scares me. He lived in society long time, very long time, killed for years and years and years, undetected, was on the news. There's news clips of this guy as a park ranger. I mean, that guy wore masks. He had a different mask to match the environment he was in. He was a chameleon. He could hide in plain sight. Where Ed Kemper, I think his ability to murder, again, stems from his childhood, from his parents, the environments he was in, and then, isn't clear to me. The women he murdered, they didn't look or resemble his mother whatsoever. And that's the mystery to me, because in any of his interviews, when he asked about his victims and why they were chosen, I don't know if you noticed this or not in his interviews, but he redirected a lot. He was a really smart guy, man. He redirected. Now, did he tell the FBI what his motives were for these particular victims? Unknown. Even in the show, really, and then when you watch that show, Mindhunter, how much of that is matter of fact? We don't know. We got to keep in mind it's a show. But I watched his interviews, and he just redirected. I never really got a clear motive on each individual. Again, there was an Asian girl, an Irish girl, all these different ethnicities, none of them really resembling mom. So when you lump all this together, in the world of serial killers, is it possible for law enforcement to really profile them with undeniable accuracy? I don't know. That's a good question for Jason White and some of these other guys later, because I don't see the pattern. I really don't. Other than they killed some animals in their childhood. And if parental abuse was the sole cause of people becoming murderers, Michael Jackson would have been a serial killer times 9, Prince would have been a serial killer. A lot of these celebrities, you hear about their childhoods and their parents' abuse on them and overworking, they'd all be murderers. Are they all narcissists? No, because you can't say that either. It's a lot of them are very recluse. Some of them are narcissistic. Others, who knows? So the scariest part of all this is these people live among us, and it's really up to us to be more aware of your surroundings when you feel uncomfortable. Because you have an instinct. We all have an instinct. And when you're, maybe not all, I don't know, but I know when I'm in a presence of someone I consider dangerous, you can almost sense it. It's like a weird energy. So I don't, Leslie, at the end of the day, what do you think Ed Kemper, in your opinion, if he was in society today, let's say he got paroled, which would never happen, does he go back to that person?
Well, for one thing, he is coming up for parole again in 2024. And I would like to say there's absolutely no chance that he would ever get released. But I think we've seen sort of a trend recently that people are being released that we can't quite believe it. And I think from what I understand that Kemper a few years ago had a fairly significant stroke. And I can imagine that a case could be made that he is not a danger because, of course, now he's got physical limitations. And, after all, he's this age. He's, 76 about right now?
Right, yeah, yes.
He'll be 77. I'm not saying I think they'll let him out, but with things as crazy as they are, I don't know that I would be surprised.
If they let that guy out or any other danger to society, there's got to be tracking involved, whether it be a permanent ankle bracelet or an implant. Like, look what Elon Musk is coming out with Neuralink, let's be honest, man. Neuralink's a great idea in a lot of ways, but bad in others because you can be tracked. Everywhere you go, tracked. What if someone hacks into it and your mind is not your own? But at the end of the day, ultimately, for dangerous people, they're going to be tracked. They're going to be monitored 100%. There's no way they would put, I don't care if that guy was 90, he is 6'9", and let's say age took about 2 inches. He's 6'7", he's plus 200 something pounds. It wouldn't be a stretch for him to overpower a teenage girl. He's going to be dangerous till the day he is no longer with us.
Yes.
Period. So he'd have to be. I don't think he'll be released. Personally, I don't think any serial killer has a shot in hell of being released. At the very minimum, they go to a minimum security prison where there's a day room, and and let's say they had a stroke and they're confined to a wheelchair. They're still. I guess at the end of the day, society just feels better when dangerous people are not eligible to go to the local supermarket.
Of course. Yeah. But I just hear every once in a while, I hear reports, and it happens a little more often than I feel comfortable with, hearing people that got out that should have been kept in prison that have gone out and killed again. And maybe not Ed Kemper, but people that are definitely dangerous and should still be in prison. So it's a little frightening.
Yeah, no doubt, especially someone with his intelligence. People need to remove the idea that murder is just physical, right? This guy could conjure up some ideas that kill somebody with just, the advent of a machine or a pill or something, this should creep you out. I read a study that a lot of serial killers are in positions of power, modern day. Let's think of what positions of power are. CEOs. attorneys, even scarier, doctors.
Mm.
How many of them watch the lights go out? Let's say you're a doctor, you work in trauma. You get to get that satisfaction of seeing life end without having to be a suspect in a serial killing. At that point, how do you balance what's good or bad when you don't know? There was a nurse, if you recall, that was over medicating patients to watch them die. How long did that go on? That was a long time. That wasn't something they figured out, well, it's been a couple of weeks. There's a pattern. No, this went on for a long time. It's crazy. I try to tell people all the time. I'm very big on this. People, they have this distaste for law enforcement. Oh, this guy was killed under law enforcement. But then, there's nurses that were killers. Like there's businessmen that were serial. There was one, I can't remember his name now. I wish I wrote it down. He was a traveling businessman under suspicion for a lot of murders. And he was both smart enough and he was wealthy enough to cover his tracks. I mean, you can't lump these people in the same category. There's different levels to it, just like there's different levels to society. And unfortunately, the majority of the victims tend to be mid to lower class. And I'll tell you, when serial killers and murders are apprehended pretty quickly, when it's the upper class. Because then the capital's rolling out, we prize money and et cetera. The only exception to that was John Benet Ramsey. That's still a mystery. And that's something I'm going to cover with you and Jason and the rest of the team, because I've found out some information about that case that troubles me to my core, that it's not really nationally spoken about. And this is, back in the 90s, but still, a young lady's life was taken. And it's a tragedy in and out, and it should be solved. And forget the satisfaction of society of saying, oh, we caught this guy. It's giving that young lady her true rest, closure. It's an atrocity. They haven't really put forth better efforts for it. It's even more an atrocity to some of the people that were in law enforcement that knew about it were silenced. That troubles me. But as far as serial kills and you and your close call, like, let's be honest, Leslie, you dodged a bullet. This guy was in his vetting stage. He was in his he was maturing as a killer. He was honing skills, and you really got that's a scary thought for you.
Well, and I think he had other ambitions, just like the lieutenant had told me. He had plans to kill everyone in the neighborhood. But if you read some of his other interviews or just excerpts of things that he alluded to, he sort of talks about having considered a big show of some sort, a big, I don't know what he was meaning, because he doesn't say, but it sounds like killing a whole neighborhood or doing something really. It occurred to him. He pondered it. He decided not to, and aren't we all glad? But
that's a bit of grandiose,
capable.
Huh? It's very grandiose of him. That's almost borderline narcissistic. He just didn't act on it. That's creepy, man.
But I have maybe 5 excerpts of either interviews I listened to or I read about that he alludes to that. And it just, we could say, and Sandy could probably speak to this better than you or I could, but was all of this because of the stored up anger with his mother? Did he have so much of that internal that he not only took it out on these young women, but then ultimately his mother, but he was thinking of what to do with all that rage. And maybe he thought that was a way to, to let some of that off. I don't know.
Yeah, it's, so let me put in perspective. Everyone on planet Earth, me included, had a bully in their life at one time or another. And every one of us who had been bullied always had this fantasy of overcoming. You know, that moment in your fantasy where you're a superhero and you're going to show that bully. I acted on that, got in trouble, right? Where in Ed Kemper's life, I could only imagine having the person you're supposed to confide and trust in the most is your abuser. You know, your bully's at school. You fantasize about getting back at the bully. You may or may not see that bully ever again. It's not a prolonged, ongoing abuse. It's just isolated moments in your life where you're like, I should have showed him or I should have did this. And then, you know, measure that against the person who brought you into the world, who is supposed to be 100% the person you rely on, that you love and cares for you. And that's your abuser for the foreseeable future. And whether or not he was locked in a basement versus he had to live in it, you know, there at some level, the mother chose to do that. She saw some reason to shield her daughters from him for whatever reason. But in his mind, it's the dungeon and the bottom of this moated castle. You know, how do you confront that? What role is that playing in psychosis? Who knows?
Well, and the conflict of that, of course, is, and he mentions it in his interviews. He says he hated his mother, but he loved her.
Right.
I think there's just a natural sense as human beings, you know, that we love our parents. You know, we love them. They're our parents. And you see that acted out in abusive households where the kids insist on staying with an abusive parent because they love that parent, even though they're treated poorly. So here, you know, how do you reconcile hating that person and loving that person? And here they are. They're that person in your life that it's not like you walk away and you have another mother. I mean, they're like the only way is to eliminate her, right. I guess. I'm not sure, but
this is demonstrated in marriage all the time. I love you. I married you. I hate your guts. You see this a lot, you know, and it's different for your mom or your dad, unless you're estranged. And even then, so, you know, for me anyway, from what I learned, they're your parents, you love them, but you didn't spend time with them. You're not abused, but they neglected or they were unavailable for your emotional needs. And there's that blame game and you're the reason I'm this way, but I love you. I see all that. You know, a good example of instinct for love is I watched it. It broke my heart years ago. So this documentary where an elephant was killed, and the baby, it was the way it mourned and fought and stood by its mother's dead body. That broke my heart. And so I'm not going to say elephants are unintelligent, but you know, humans, when we lose someone, we mourn them, we bury them, we move on. That baby, its whole world collapsed in front of it. And then there's even other videos. I always tend to look at the animal kingdom when you really want to break down the emotional bonds of biology, because there's a video that stood out to me where a cheetah came across a baby monkey, and rather than kill it, it nurtured it. Now, this is a predator that's nurturing a fellow animal, a primate, that they're usually enemies. So when you go to the human factor of Ed Kemper, like how could he love his mother and hate her at the same time? It's deep-rooted instinct that loves mom, but it's the logic of what she's doing to me that hates her. And there's a conflict there. And I think no matter how intelligent you are, when you have that kind of emotional conflict, there's a breaking point. You know, it's often said that most people at high IQ that are inventors and scientists border on insanity. You know, because there's just so much inside of them that they can't find a balance, and there's a breaking point. They lose it. You know, I mean, it was alleged that Einstein used to pace the house talking to himself. I don't think that's crazy. I do that all the time. You know, so I have full-on arguments with myself about small subjects. So for Ed Kemper, that's his balance. Again, at the end of the day, when he turns himself in, I think there's this balance of logic and reason as far with using intelligence for that, because his emotional responses were murder. So scary business, really is. And again, for most people, exercise caution in public, period. We don't know who's dangerous. We don't know who's not. I'm not saying to walk around in a shell all day. Just be aware of your surroundings. And if you have an instinct, I'm not saying act on your instinct, but we have them for a reason. We're supposed to detect predators. And the majority of the cases I read about where these women were victim to these or anyone, I'm not just women, anyone who was victim to these predators, 9 out of 10 times they had an instinct on the person. They didn't have a good feeling or something struck them as odd. Unless your murderer is an absolute psychology genius who could, there's a few out there. Ted Bundy. That guy was remarkable at switching who he was. He could speak to you in a very genuine way and compel and convince you to be around him and then turn into a monster instantly. I did an interview with Cloyd Steiger and Mike Sadzitsky, homicide detectives. They were talking about the serial killer they captured in the Northwest. And this guy was hey, guys, how's it do? Where's my burgers? And he'd give him information. And when they brought up the information on one of his victims that got away, it's like his demeanor completely changed. It's really dark. Like, yeah, I remember her. Like, he was disappointed that victim got away. You got to see that guy's other face for that split second, and that gave me chills. So, yeah, I don't know.
There's a story, I don't know if you came across it, but there's a story about Kemper going and seeing his psychiatrist that he was supposed to check in with after he'd gotten out of Atascadero. They were making a decision about whether to permanently seal his juvenile records. And he had to go see 2 of them on the same day at different locations. And while he had a head of one of his victims in the trunk of his car.
Yeah.
And they said glowing things about how he was assimilating back into living a normal life and how adjusted he was. And they were all in favor of sealing up those records.
Yeah, and that head in the car is the one that he buried at his mother's facing her room. I mean, yeah, if he could be that person just after a murder and go before a review to find out if he's capable of being in society and being expunged, Jesus, that's got to speak volumes. That's crazy. I don't know. So for me personally, when I hear these stories and I read about these cases, it's my hat's off to law enforcement that have to follow these people and have to investigate them, because it's not an easy task. There's like David Berkowitz, son of Sam. I got to tell you, and people in the comments, you want to disagree or whatever, fine. I think that guy wasn't even the actual killer. I think if you read about that story, there was definitely a cult in that area. And this guy, David Berkowitz, was starving for attention for whatever reason. And it's been proven that a lot of people false confess for reasons I don't see the allure of being wanting to be a known killer and go to prison and spend time in a dangerous place, but they do it. And that David Berkowitz case is a prime example. I don't know what to think of that. The Zodiac case that we're going to discuss with Jason and the team, blows my mind. It blows my mind. I mean, there's when I say a suspect list, there is in front of me, out of the amount of people I have written down 6 names I think that are plausible. But there's countless others, and there's another 3 that alleged on their own that they were there was people that said they were the guy, and law enforcement cast them aside. They didn't know details of the case, but the point is they were willing to step up and say they were the guy to go to jail to get the fame. These people exist, what a tough job. What a tough job to find these guys.
And I just like to comment to something you said a little bit ago about profiling and the FBI and how accurate that is. And I guess it's like all these other things you're talking about, like always pay attention to that gut feeling you have, or just an off feeling you have about somebody. Maybe sometimes it means nothing, but it might mean something 80% of the time. And with these profilers, maybe they're not 100% accurate. Maybe certain people slip through their profile and it's really someone else, but they at least can narrow down the possibilities and maybe make it a little bit easier for the officer on the street to find the person that's responsible. But, they're not going to catch, there are too many variables. I agree with you. There's just too many things that factor in to what somebody does. And if they're the real person, the real killer, the real responsible person. But I think it's more in generalities that they can at least give some tips to narrow down the search.
Sure. I mean, listen, I have people argue with me over stupidity all the time. So I have this thing where I say there's no such thing as exact science. Like, yeah, well, how's your house powered? That's exact science. You never had a power outage? You never had a short? Your light bulb didn't crack? There is no exact science. It's not possible. I mean, we can't know exactly for anything. If we learned anything in life, Murphy's Law, pretty powerful deal. You know what I mean? You have to make room for it. And as far as instincts, I won't say his name, but I have a friend that we hung out. He's in the pool hall one time, long time ago. And I got to go. I'm like, why? He goes, because he had deja vu. And in his mind, whatever he was doing that day is now canceled. And so I get deja vu time to time. And sometimes there's this ominous feeling that surrounds it. Like, oh, something's wrong here. You know what I mean? Where that stems from, unclear. But even I get a little paranoid, but I won't change my whole day. This dude just went home, stayed home. He's like that. As far as motives, Dennis Rader, does anyone even have an idea why or what his motive was? I mean, there was interviews, there was things speculated, but Dennis Rader, like Kemper, like Ted Bundy, like a lot of these other guys, divert. They move, they are controlling the conversation. They will answer you in half truth and steer another direction. And I've noticed this if there's a pattern, that's the pattern. Even with Jeffrey Dahmer, I watched the interviews, the interrogations, and they're redirecting more often than they are answering. And so the motives it's really hard to say, did he abuse animals? Well, if he abused animals, what caused it? What, you're telling me this guy was just born to murder? And sometimes that's true. Sometimes there's something in your biology or physiology, something that's altered. Something like they're doing studies of brains and scanning the brains of these murderers now. To what degree of accuracy? Again, that boils down to what do we consider 100%? It's there's like you said, there's variables we don't know. So I don't know. Creepy. It's really hard to narrow down motive or cause and effects. Again, I had a friend, he'd get deja vu, he'd cancel his day, So instincts, if you're in a situation where you feel uncomfortable, let logic prevail a little bit. Question, why do I feel? Who makes me uncomfortable? Why am I uncomfortable? Maybe I should remove myself from this situation. I'm not saying that's going to save your life every time or at all for that matter, but, it's got to play some kind of role.
Well, don't get in the car with somebody, that's for sure. For
certain, especially when you're in an area. In the beginning, when he's picking hitchhikers up, he's testing. There's no co-ed killer. But when there is a co-ed killer, and there was a period of time where he was picking these girls up literally just to get information on what they know or what information they obtain about it. If you're getting into a car with a man who looks like he could dunk basketballs from a stance, question your own logic at that point. What were you doing?
I don't think you could tell until he got out.
No,
just from everything. Yeah,
I have a friend who's 6'7". When he's sitting in the car, you 100% know he's bigger than most people.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you could see, because when I sit in a car, I know where my head level's getting to. But when your torso is longer, and typically whether it be your legs or torso, if it's your legs that have the majority of the length, your seat's way back. When it's your torso, your head's, there. That's why, literally, I swear to you, one of the reasons that Ed Kemper couldn't get into the police department was because of his size. That was literally one of the reasons. Pilots for fighter pilots for our U.S. military, their size plays a role in what they can or cannot do. And so when I say all this, when you see a person, whether they're seated or standing, you could tell. You know what I mean? When the guy sitting down is taller than your 13-year-old, you know? So, but all that aside, when there's a co-ed killer loose and there's a guy picking you, you're hitchhiking and, you know, there's women going missing, some of that, you know, you should be, logic should have prevailed there. Like, maybe I shouldn't get in a car with this stranger. And I think the reason they felt comfortable, what was the law enforcement instructed them, like, if they didn't have a university sticker in the car, don't get in?
I don't think law enforcement said anything about that. The students themselves just presumed if it had a sticker on it, it was safe because it belonged to faculty. And that was definitely something that I think people trusted him if they noticed. I don't know. I know that they had a lot of difficulties. I don't know if you saw that with the interviews with the law enforcement there, but they were saying how they were trying to make a big deal to co-eds in the area. Don't do this. You know, we're having, you know, someone's murdering young women. Don't hitchhike. And yet people continued to do it.
Jeez, I don't know. I don't know. You can't presume that everyone that works on campus is safe, because when there's co-eds going missing and you're doing this rule out phase, at some point, if they're catching co-eds, maybe is it the janitor? Is it the principal? We don't know. You know, like, what was the female serial killer, the monster? What was her name? God, I can't think of her name. Regardless, let's say monster. Which really should have been like a sign itself. It's a woman. And, you know, her motives were pretty clear. The abuse, she was forced into prostitution. She didn't have money to survive. You know, anyone could be a murderer. You know, you can't, I think that's where we make really poor decisions, is when we're basing it on their gender, their status in life. You can't, that's crazy to even think that. Like, you know, I don't know. The populace needs to come to the consensus and understand that you can't, I'm not saying live life in a shell, because that's unhealthy. You know, you got to go experience life. You got to have experiences. You got to, you know, be social. But at the same time, if it's pitch black, well, I don't think that's a case today, right? With Uber, technology, I don't think people really if people are hitchhiking, I don't notice it. I don't see it either. Yeah. I mean, I think the numbers have dwindled for very obvious reasons, because it's with today's technology, it's kind of hard to be trapped out on the road somewhere. You can call or Google or just anything for that matter. But back then, you're on a dark road and you're thumbing it out because you're stranded. You're very aware of a murder in the area. I don't know. I would assume walk. I would not get in a car. Even then, I'd probably walk on the off-beaten path. I don't know. It's nuts, you know? In any regard, Leslie, before we close out, is there anything you want to add?
No, I don't think so. As far as the Kemper story, I'm just doing a lot of research about that particular period of his life, because most of the books and programs are during the period where he was actively looking and picking up women, and then they're about the crime as well as the courtroom drama and all that took place, since he tried to commit suicide several times. So that's where most of those resources are. And this is kind of a different period that I'm covering, is more the time after he got out of Atascadero and before the first murders took place.
So that sounds like a book for you, especially with your experience. I would definitely look into authoring something of that, because close call. You were in that vetting stage, that honing the skill stage. That's scary business. Anyhow, for those of you that are listening, we're going to say good evening, good day, good night, whatever it is for you, and I'm going to talk to Leslie in post.